You are on a live machine, a ventilator. What happens in this case is that that live machine or ventilator will breathe air into your lungs, will send oxygenated blood to your heart, and then there are certain centers in the heart that can be activated by this, and that your heart can beat without the brain stem being alive. Yet that heart beating is completely dependent on this machine that's breathing into you, or that's giving you air. Once you take this machine away, it will be only a few minutes until your heart subsides or it stops beating. So if the brainstem dies or the entire brain dies, which includes the entire brain from the brainstem all the way up to the cortex, that is called brain death. Now, if the brain cortex, which is the qishratul dimag, which is the outermost part of the brainstem, is called jizr dimag. The cortex is called qishratul dimag. If the cortex, which is the qishratul dimag, outermost part of your brain dies, you will lose the functions that are most indicative of life in general, which is the function of awareness and the function of will. You will not be willful and you will not be aware. In other words, there is no input or output. That is complete death of these areas. Sometimes it varies. Sometimes the neurologists sometimes disagree over have they completely lost all awareness or have they not. Even in the case of Terri Schiavo, if you remember Terri Schiavo in Florida, she had persistent vegetative state, and her parents and husband were fighting over, removing the feeding tube. And so, remember, she was not brain dead. She had persistent vegetative state. Her brain stem was alive. Her cortex died. So, two of the neurologists said that she doesn't have any awareness, and one neurologist said that she does have some awareness of her surroundings. So there's something going into her. Nothing is coming out. Or, sometimes that was contested also, because her parents indicated that they do feel her responsiveness, that there is something coming out. These two things, which is will and awareness, are actually defining characteristics of the human life. You see, in the books of ta'rifat, which is the books of terminology, ta'rifat, ta'rif, etc., al-Jurjani, al-Munawi, and others indicated that life, the human life, differs from the other types of life, vegetative life, hayatun nabat, by two characteristics, al-ilm wal-qudra. Al-hayatu halatun yakhtassu biha al-hayawan tatamayazu bil-ilmi wal-qudra. That the human life is a condition that distinguishes or animate life is a condition that distinguishes animals from the rest of the living things, which are the plants, and the characteristics of it are ilm, which is awareness, wal-qudra, which is will, capacity, ability to do things. So if you completely lack ilm, which is awareness, and qudra, which is capacity to do things, are you alive? That would be a big question. Now, in this case of Terri Schiavo, persistent vegetative state, when your brain cortex dies, but your brain stem is alive, and your heart is beating, and remember, in this case, her heart is beating on its own, not with the machine, not with the ventilator, because her brain stem is alive. But all she needs is a feeding tube, in this case. She does need every once in a while many things, but in order for you to maintain the life of someone who has persistent vegetative state, you don't have a tube down their throat to breathe for them. Sometimes you need to, but most of the time you don't need to. All you need is to have a feeding tube, a tube that gets inserted into the stomach to feed them. And to have this feeding tube will maintain their life. Certainly you will have to flip them, and there are many other complex medical procedures that have to be done, but they are breathing on their own, their heart is beating on their own, yet they cannot eat. So you feed them through the feeding tube, and in this way they can just live like this for many, many years. Did the Muslim scholars disagree on this being a life? No. They all agreed that this is a life. That the case of Tereshaiva she would be still alive. Despite the fact that traditionally we said in our books in the terminology that al-haya, that the animate life is distinguished from the inanimate life by two things, which are al-ilm, awareness, and qudra, which is capacity. That means output and input and output. But the consensus of the Muslim scholars nowadays is that this would be considered still a living being, because the heart is beating on its own and she's breathing. So how can you say that she's not alive if her heart is beating on its own and she is breathing on her own? Yeah, yet the controversy would then arise in this case over the requirement of treating her. Is it required to treat her in this case? And that is when the scholars disagreed. And that is when the disagreement is very intense, because some of the scholars would consider the feeding tube to be a modality of feeding. And if you do not feed her, you're withholding food from a living being. And the Prophet ﷺ said for the woman who withheld food from a cat, that she will be tormented in the hellfire for withholding food from a cat. So then they do make a big case here that this is not acceptable to withhold food from that patient. The other group of scholars would say this is in fact not withholding food. The Prophet ﷺ blamed the people who force-fed him when he was sick. You know, his people of his household, including his wives, in the sickness, in his last sickness, they force-fed him by pushing food down his throat. So the Prophet ﷺ blamed them when he became aware. And so in this case, is feeding through a feeding tube a type of feeding, or is it a type of treatment? It seems to me to be a type of treatment, so I would actually agree with the scholars who say it's a type of treatment, not a type of feeding, because this is not food that is grown in the field. You're not bringing them, chicken soup or you're not going to bring them like an apple and push it through. It is food that is processed, that is made in laboratories, and it is processed in certain ways and certain complex ways. Not everyone can do this. It requires a medical team, it requires medical expertise, and it requires medical expertise in the first place to put this feeding tube in. But the problem would be after you put the feeding tube in, it's already there. Would you push this food or not push this food? Is it food or is it medicine? I would actually side with scholars who say that this is medicine. In this case, treatment is not obligatory. Because treatment in Islam is not obligatory unless the abstinence from treatment would result in significant harm that can be avoided by the treatment without side effects that are equal to or more than the harm inflicted by the medicine. Is that clear? So if abstinence from treatment will cause significant harm, that is more than the harm of the medicine itself, clearly more than the harm of the medicine itself, then treatment is mandatory. In all other cases, or in most cases, treatment is preferable. In some cases, treatment is permissible. That is when the harm of the treatment and the harm of